6. All right? So, when we're looking at, yes?
I didn't get it.
Uh-oh.
You lying.
I just need one.
Oh, yes, because last semester there were a pile of pens sitting up here. I don't know, has anybody got a spare pencil, please? Okay, question 1. Which involuntary action type, so there's 2 different types of involuntary action, involves a stimulus? Spontaneous movements or reflexes? Thank you. That's so cool. I was trying to make a ghost, but it didn't work. Yeah. Which involuntary action type involves a stimulus? Spontaneous movements or reflexes?
You said spontaneous or what?
Spontaneous movements or reflexes? Question number 2. Give an example of a motor milestone. And there's piles of them. So give one example of a motor milestone. Okay, question 1. Which involuntary action type involves a stimulus? Spontaneous movements or reflexes? Question 2. Give an example of a motor milestone. Make sure you've got your surname on there as well so that we can put them in alphabetical order for putting on
What name on it?
last name. Surname. Ryan, you want it? 1 out of 25 is not bad. I'll go with those odds. All right, okay, swap them over. All right, so 1 point for each question. Okay, question 1. Which involuntary action type involves a stimulus? Reflexes.
Yes.
So, and give an example of a motor milestone. So, the more obvious ones are sitting up, pulling up to stand, standing, walking, but they may have lifting the head. Anybody got anything else?
Crawling. Erase it.
Let's have a look. It's got a whole long list of motor milestones. Rotating is rolling from front to back, sitting alone, thumb on position, pulling to standing. Walking. I'll check those when I go through them and put them on the spreadsheet. So if you're not sure whether or not they have a motor milestone, don't worry, because I'll check them all. No, that's not an example. It's a description of what it is, but it's not an example. Okay, all right, Charlie will collect those, and I will check that second question when I put them on the spreadsheet. Okay, all right. So,
Come on.
I want to stop at about 20. So, at the most, we're going to do half an hour because I've got your exams to give back, okay?
Oh, we'll see.
All right, so we're starting to look at movements we can see. We're going to start with early movements. And when we're looking at what we see later on, remember, as we said with the prenatal stuff, everything we see later on comes from what happens when we're small, right? So this is a building block for what we see later on. So we've got to have some understanding of what we ought to be seeing, all right? And how does that impact movement later on when the child is moving more voluntarily? So initially we're going to start with moves that are involuntary. So we're looking at quite young infants. Most of these movements have kind of abated by around 7 or 8 months. We still see a couple of them at around a year or so, but we don't see them all the way through into being a toddler typically, right? The first group are spontaneous movements, and they don't react to a stimuli. They just occur, right? So we just see these spontaneous movements. The child will kick its legs or shake its arms, okay? Another word for spontaneous movements is stereotypies. So in some textbooks they're called stereotypies rather than spontaneous movements. Just depends which book you're looking at, right? And the second group are reflexes, and reflexes are movement responses that are elicited by a specific stimulus. So it's a very specific response to a very specific stimulus. They don't interact. Right? Originally, we used to think that these involuntary movements really didn't serve very much of a purpose, particularly when we were looking at the first group, spontaneous movements. That they didn't serve a purpose, they were just random firing of the central nervous system. However, more recently, when they've been able to look at these movements more carefully and use some very cool biomechanical techniques, some clever filming, EMG, little dots on joints, and then they film them and analyze the movement of the dots, then what we've seen is that actually they appear to be related to some later movements that we see that are voluntary. Not the same as, they're similar to later movements. So it's not exactly the same when we look at a young child kicking, but it is very similar to something we see later on. Right? So that now we think, well, really then, maybe they're building blocks for the brain. It's the brain just starting to figure out, how do I turn that muscle on? What do I have to do? What does that involve? When I turn it on, what happens? Right? What kind of feedback do I get when I kick that leg or I move that arm? So they seem to be important, not random, and they seem to be linked to other movements. If you look at page 104, they've got some diagrams here that are based on film sequences that they have, and what they're trying to show is that although they're not the same, right, they're clearly not the same, there are similarities between spontaneous kicking and adult walking. So the timing and the way that the legs move in opposition to each other. One of the things that's different is that when the baby kicks, the hip joint, the knee joint, and the ankle joint all flex and extend at the same time. Whereas when we see adult walking, they contract and change in sequence to each other. So the movement is similar, but the sequencing isn't there. So that's why people think that perhaps now these stereotypies are important tools for the brain to learn how to control these segments and how to turn on particular muscle fibers and learn what the outcome of that is. So, I don't know if you need the lights off. Let's see. And all these film clips are on your textbook website, so you can watch them again, right? So this kicking that we see here for this baby is totally involuntary. She's not kicking her legs. Her brain is kicking her legs. Subconscious, way below cortical level. There might be some subcortical involvement there. It may just be occurring at the spinal column. There's nothing going on in the cortex when we look at this movement, right? So when you watch them at this age, it's fascinating because she's not doing that, right?
Doesn't that seem like when they see like some bright color, they start freaking out?
Yeah, could be. It depends what age you're looking at. But yeah, if you're looking at 4 to 6 weeks, then yes, it could be the stimulation of the color.
What about like, I saw a video where like he's holding his baby and then like the baby gave him the finger. That's just, that's involvement.
That's a reflex. We'll get to that one.
Okay.
Alright, so stereotypies are these what look like from the outside just random movements. They're not necessarily in response to anything. Right, she was looking at mum. It was probably mum with the ball, and her legs are kicking. Has nothing to do with her interaction with mum. Okay. The other group of involuntary movements, reflexes, occur in response to a stimulus. So the stimulus is very specific. I suspect what happened on the one that you were looking at, one of the reflexes that we see is called a palmar grasp. So if you put your finger across the palm of the baby grabs your fingers. So maybe if he was just pushing on the outside part of the palm, maybe he managed to get like those fingers to contract and one to stay up, possibly.
What about suckling?
Suckling is a reflex. Yeah. All right, so reflexes occur in response to a very particular set of stimuli. Typically, one muscle or a very tightly linked group of muscles. It's not the whole body, so that whole leg action, that much more global movement is not a reflex. Right? you can't extinguish them. So what that means is that if I present the stimulus over and over and over and over again, I will see the reflex over and over and over and over again. It doesn't kind of get used to it and go away. Okay? So, all right, it doesn't attenuate, it doesn't get used to the stimulus. If we see persistence of a reflex, so we have a general guideline of the timeline that we would expect these reflexes to occur, right? With a range, because not everything happens at the same time, it's just like everything else we see when we look at development. There's a pattern that we expect, but individuality is going to mean that each child does it slightly differently, right? So there's not an exact time point, there's a range of age that you would expect to see these. If we see persistence, so persistence would be a significant amount of time outside the range that is considered normal, then that might indicate some kind of neurological problem. All right? So we can use them to check for typical development. So when you have a baby, when you go for your postnatal checkups and things, the clinicians will run some checks that are checking reflexes, because it's a way of seeing whether or not the brain is doing what it's supposed to do. Okay. If they're there and they're not meant to be there, or if perhaps we see imbalance across the left and right side. So if you get a very, very strong palmar grip on one hand and not on the other hand, that might indicate some problem that they would want to investigate, possibly. Right? Some of our reflexes exist right through our lifespan. So if someone suddenly moves their arm towards your face, right, we blink. If a car backfires, you see a startle reflex in an adult the same way you would in a baby. If you go to athletic training or to the doctor, they sometimes will do a knee tap test. That's a reflex. Right? So we do have reflexes as adults, it's just there's a lot more of them that we see on a regular basis when we're looking at infants. And reflexes have some, when you look at them, they seem to have some very obvious jobs to do, right? They can be divided up. Some books divide them into 2 groups. Our textbook divides them into 3 separate groups. So we have primitive reflexes, postural reflexes, and locomotor reflexes. The primitive reflexes appear to be ways of protecting the baby. Right? So, suckling is a primitive reflex. Right? The baby, if you touch around its lips, will start to suck. Well, that's how they get food. So if they weren't able to suck, and we don't have voluntary control of the throat and the swallowing mechanism at that age, so how would they get food and survive? Right? So it's a reflex action that allows survival. It also allows dialogue with the environment. So again, the palmar grasp one is a great example. Right? You go over, you bend over the baby, you're playing with the baby, you touch its hand, it grabs hold of your finger. What's your response to that? Right? Little baby's hanging onto your finger. What are you going to do as the adult? Oh, look, that's so cute. Oh, right? So that reflex stimulates interaction with the adult and the baby, right? So it allows for the baby to start to learn about its environment. Might not be a deliberate movement, but that movement has repercussions that allow the baby to start to learn about things that are going on in the environment. Okay? So they get sensory consequences because they get unconsciously, I mean they're not cognitive of this, but their brain gets feedback that tells it what the consequence was. So next time it does that movement, what's going to occur. All right? And especially when we start to look at postural and locomotor reflexes, we really do see that they could be leading to future movements. There's a, they look like things we see in just a couple of months' time. So, this one is a primitive reflex, asymmetrical tonic neck reflex. Baby's lying on its back, and if you turn the baby's head to one side, more often than not, you will see this reflex. So the way the head turns, the arm and the leg on that side stretch out, the arm and the leg on the other side tuck up. So they call it an archery, sometimes a fencing position. Okay. And if you think about that, if you put the baby down, you don't want the baby to roll and smother itself. If you turn the baby's head, then that leg and arm extending would stop the baby from rolling.
Isn't it also because like they throw up in their sleep or something like that? My mom used to say that it changes all the time because for each of her kids, like one would be on your side, one would be on your back with the head turned, one would be on your stomach. So does that just change for that kind of purpose?
This particular reflex is when it's lying on its back, and you don't see this in every baby, but most babies exhibit it. Would it stop the baby from throwing up and gagging?
Yeah.
Yes, because the head is turned to one side. Reflexes are cool. Very cool. Palmar grasp, we've already said, if you touch the baby on its hand with a pencil or your finger, or girls with longer hair will know if the hair, then the hair gets grabbed, right? Or a necklace will get grabbed. It's great. Problem is they can't ungrab at this age, so you have to like pry all their fingers off to get your hair or your necklace back or your finger back. Right? Symmetrical tonic neck reflex is another primitive one where they're sitting up, and if you put their head back, their arms extend, their legs flex. If you tuck their head forwards, then their arms tuck in and their legs stretch out. I've watched that one and I can't for the life of me work out why that would be a lifesaver. But the brain wouldn't do it for no reason. So the brain's learning something because of that reflex. And we don't know the answers to everything that's going on, obviously, in a new baby's brain at this point, even though we've learned a lot. Ignore stepping at the moment. We'll come back to that. That shouldn't be on that slide. Moreau is a pre-startle reflex. So we see Moreau first, and then you see startle a bit later on. So you can shake the head, so you can tap the pillow or shake the pillow a little bit. And the baby's arms and legs and fingers stretch out and then flex. As that starts to disappear, then we see a startle. And if you think about catch someone out over the weekend, right? Startle someone and see what you see. What we do in a startle reflex is this, right? So we get rid of the extension part and we just do the flexion part as we transition from Moreau to startle. And as I said, startle's one of those ones that we hang on to all the way through. So check your reflexes. There's a big long table. They split them up into the 3 groups for you. Makes it easy for you to try to visualize. There's lots of film of different reflexes. So the primitive ones we don't see for very long. Postural reactions start somewhere around 4 months. Right? The primitive ones typically are weakening at around 4 months. Some of them have already stopped occurring. Postural reactions literally look like they're trying to teach the brain how to maintain posture in our environment with gravity. They are initially a reflex, so if I do a particular thing, we see this reaction to it. And then gradually, as we start voluntary movement, those postural reflexes just become something that's voluntary. So the labyrinthine writing reflex is a classic one. If people, human beings like to be upright, right? We like to be upright and we like to be straight, preferably, right? That's our most comfortable. For some people, that is such a strong reaction and feeling that it's very difficult to teach them to do gymnastics or other types of sport where they would have to go upside down or be on angles and things. I've had children that you literally cannot teach them to do a forward roll or a handstand because their brain will not let them go upside down. Right? Well, I can't teach you a handstand or a forward roll if your head is sticking out like this. Right? So for some people, that feeling of going upside down or being on a tilt is so uncomfortable that they never really get over that. So what we see with the baby is if I lean them to the side, that their head will stay upright for as long as possible. Okay? So they're learning to control their neck muscles, they're learning proprioception, what is upright. Derotative writing, so if they're lying on their back and you turn their head to one side, then their shoulders and their pelvis will roll as well. Right? So again, if I do this, now I'm not kind of all straight, so the body will roll. That's the start of making the muscles strong enough to roll over. Right? At some point, this baby is going to deliberately roll over, all on its own, voluntarily choose to roll to get to somewhere else. Right? So right now, it doesn't have the strength to roll over. Remember how big its head is in relation to the rest of its body, right? It's just not strong enough to roll over. It's got to develop that strength, and the brain has to learn, what do I turn on in order to roll? Right? So these are all things that the brain is learning and that are going on while we see that one. Parachute is another one we hang on to as an adult. So if I trip, what do we tend to do? Just put your hand out. Right? Anybody do martial arts or have any gymnastic stuff? When you did your martial arts, did they spend time making you practice falling and rolling without putting your hand down? Right? Because when we put our hand down, what happens? We break, right? We break our wrist, we break our arm. If we're unlucky, you break your elbow. Elbows are bad because they're a pain in the neck to put right. Sometimes they aren't put right and you end up with an arm that's slightly bent forever. Right? Think about an elderly population. You often see elderly people in a cast because they've slipped on ice and they put their hand down, right? So that's a reflex. It's really, you have to train a lot to override the reflex and not put your hand down. It's really hard, even though you know you shouldn't. It stops you from breaking your skull. On the other hand, a broken nose is easier to fix than a broken elbow. So, right? But we never really get rid of a parachute, and if you hold the baby and drop them toward, not drop them, but lower them toward the floor, you'll see the baby stretch out its arms and its legs. We don't want to drop the baby. That would be bad. Okay?
Look at you.
All right? So, what we see, let me go back with the locomotor one. What we see with the postural reflexes then are all reflexes that appear to help the brain learn. Posture is an interesting topic, and later in the chapter we'll look a little bit more at posture, because when you first stand up, there's a lot going on here that you've got to learn to control in order to stand up. Right? So from being in the womb to lying down on a blanket, there's a lot of strength and a lot of coordination has to be learned by the brain in order to sit up and then stand up and then control all this while we try to start learning to walk. Okay. If we had EMG, and we put EMG on you now, you'd be amazed how much work is going on in your back muscles and your stomach and your rib cage and all, just to keep you sitting upright and not blobbing off onto the floor. Okay. All those muscles are firing all the time to hold you upright, or at least mostly upright. Some of you aren't quite upright. It's almost lunchtime. We're hungry. Right? Starving. Me too. So, right, in order to be upright, a lot of work is going on, because this is a ball and socket joint. It's got all kinds of movement it can do, and yet it isn't doing it when I stand. So there's a ton of work going on, firing lots of different muscles around here to hold me still. So those postural reflexes are helping the brain to learn that. Then we start to see locomotor reflexes, and there's only three. There's a swimming one. So sometimes you read people say, "Oh, I took my baby to the swimming pool, and it's only 5 months old and it can swim." Well, it really can't swim at 5 months old, but there is a swimming reflex that looks like it could be swimming.
You can teach a child at that young age to involve in water to spin up and go flow towards the edge and just grab on.
Well, you can't, because they're not doing voluntary movement at 5 months.
This is a video though.
There's a video of them doing it with the baby.
Yeah, the baby.
This is 100% fact.
Okay.
They put a baby in the pool and start swimming.
Because it has a swimming reflex, not because they taught it to swim.
You can tell it's reflex, so when you go get to the edge, and it will hold on.
It's a reflex, it can't move. Stepping reflex looks very much like walking. Right, bless you.
Thank you.
So a stepping reflex, if you hold the baby and allow it the soles of its feet to touch a tabletop or the floor, it walks. Right? It does something that looks very much like walking. It isn't walking because it's involuntary, but it looks like walking. Okay? And it's an interesting piece of research because it also gives us lots of information about what happens with constraints, because we see the stepping reflex until around, I think it's around 7 months or so, 6 to 7 months, and then it disappears. Well, we literally used to think reflexes just stop. They go away at some point. And then a couple of months later, we see the voluntary movement that was maybe training the brain for. So we see the stepping reflex disappear, and around 12 months, the baby starts to walk. Right? And it looks similar to the stepping reflex that went away. What they found, though, is that if you put the baby into a bathtub full of water, the stepping reflex will still occur. So it's a really great example of our constraints theory, because what happens is not that the reflex disappears, but the reflex disappears a little while, round about the time that the baby is putting on lots of fat cells and its legs are getting nice and heavy, but its muscles aren't getting nice and strong yet. So the stepping reflex disappears because the individual constraint of the weight of the leg changed, and the muscle system wasn't strong enough to then continue lifting the legs up and down. When we put the baby into water, when do we use water? Right? Water's great when we're injured. We do lots of water therapy if we're hurt. People who can afford expensive racehorses. Expensive racehorses spend a lot of time in pools because it is really good work for the muscles without the stress, and the body is supported by the water. Right? So I put the baby into the water, now all that extra weight on its leg is supported by the water, and we see a stepping reflex that isn't there when you take the baby out and put them on the floor. So it's a very good example of constraints changing and altering what movement we see. Okay, we'll stop there, which means we are at 1 mile.
Thank you, Ralph.